Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we transform huge stacks of complex research, historical analysis, and institutional reports into the sharp, critical insights you need. If you're looking for a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed, you are definitely in the right place.
Definitely. And today, we're undertaking a deep dive into an area that I think most people assume is pretty rigidly predictable: military education. Professional military education, or PME.
Right, you think doctrine, marching, maybe some classroom lectures on history.
Exactly. But we're pulling back the curtain on a concept that's, well, quietly revolutionizing how leaders are trained for contemporary conflict. It's Bruce Goodmanson's framework, which he calls the fourth way.
The fourth way. Okay, so our mission today is pretty ambitious then. We're going to define this fourth way, trace its, you said, radical historical roots. Sounds like it goes back a ways.
Oh, it does. Thousands of years, actually.
Wow. Okay, so trace the roots, analyze its practical application. You mentioned a decade-long project at the Marine Corps University, MCU.
That's right, the case method project. It's the real proof of concept.
And then ultimately, we need to dissect its, well, its potential, right, to cultivate intellectual resilience, adaptability, basically leaders who can think when the old rules just don't work anymore.
Precisely. It's about learning how to think when the established procedures fail you, which, happens a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And to really understand why the fourth way is so necessary, we first have to grapple with, well, frankly, the deep, enduring failures of traditional military education. PME has historically been caught in this really profound and debilitating dichotomy. It's like it swings back and forth between two extremes, and both of them ultimately kind of fail the officer.
Okay, let's unpack that dichotomy then. What are the two poles? On one side, you have the really theoretical kind of abstract approach.
So it's one pole, yeah.
Yeah.
Pure academic instruction. This is where you might spend months digging into grand strategy, discussing very abstract concepts, or maybe parsing dense theoretical texts about the nature of war.
Very Clausewitzian, maybe.
Could be, but the learning is often quite removed from the messy reality on the ground. It's cerebral, maybe even philosophical, which isn't bad in itself, but
it struggles to translate, right, to practical action when you're, I don't know, in a complex urban environment or dealing with an unexpected threat.
Exactly. It struggles to translate into a decision matrix for, say, the South China Sea or boots on the ground somewhere chaotic.
So the officer gets really good at writing an essay about war, maybe, but not necessarily equipped for the immediate demands of it. What's the other extreme then?
The opposing pole is pure pragmatism, skills-oriented training. This leans heavily on rote doctrine, checklists, standard operating procedures.
The by-the-book approach.
Very much by the book. It's often about mechanical, almost muscle memory application of established procedures. And look, this model promises certainty, efficiency. It tries to turn complex tasks into predictable algorithms.
Which sounds good in theory.
It does. But as you said, certainty is often the first casualty in modern warfare, isn't it?
Yeah. So the critique here, and this sounds like the core problem Goodmanson is tackling, is that neither of these extremes really prepares an officer for the reality they face today.
That really is the crux of the issue. Modern conflict, it's just defined by complexity, radical ambiguity, deep uncertainty. Things change incredibly fast.
Right.
So if an officer is only trained on abstract theories, they might just freeze when the situation doesn't neatly fit a historical parallel they studied.
And if they're only trained on the checklist?
Well, they're paralyzed when the enemy or the situation refuses to follow the script. They either get stuck, restricted by these rote templates, or they're lost in abstraction, unable to connect theory to the immediate, messy reality.
So the traditional system kind of fails the officer precisely at the moment they need to be most flexible, most adaptive, maybe most creative.
You've hit it.
Yeah.
The training fosters this reliance on external guides.
Yeah.
Either the big theoretical framework or the detailed procedural manual. It doesn't really cultivate internal judgment, the ability to think for oneself under pressure.
And that reliance, especially in environments where information is incomplete or maybe deliberately manipulated or just flat out absent, that becomes a huge liability.
A massive liability. You need leaders who can think when the map doesn't match the territory.
Okay, so this is where Goodmanson's fourth way comes in.
Yeah.
It doesn't just try to blend those two poles, you're saying.
No, it's not about finding a halfway point between theory and rote practice. It's about establishing an entirely new axis of learning. It's specifically designed to bridge that gap, that chasm between abstract academic theory and, well, gritty military practice.
And how does it do that? What's the core approach?
The defining characteristic really is that it's fundamentally rooted in inquiry, active questioning. It emphasizes Socratic dialogue, deep reflection, and this intensive, almost forensic analysis of historical decision-making using case studies.
Socratic dialogue.
Yeah.
So lots of questions.
Lots of questions. And not just questions from the instructor, but students questioning each other, questioning the material, questioning their own assumptions. It shifts the whole goal of education away from just transferring content.
Like pouring knowledge into an empty vessel.
Exactly. Away from that and towards cultivating intellectual maturity, developing the ability to think critically and independently.
Okay, and the ultimate promise of this pretty profound philosophical shift. He said it's not just about producing a better tactician in a narrow sense. Sounds much bigger.
It is much bigger. The stated goal is the cultivation of a specific set of what you might call intellectual virtues. Things like critical thinking, definitely enhanced adaptability, superior judgment, especially under conditions of uncertainty.
Which is most conditions, probably.
Pretty much. And this one's really key, intellectual humility.
Intellectual humility. In the military, that sounds counterintuitive, maybe.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But Goodmanson argues these qualities are the essential hallmarks of what he, borrowing from Donald Schoen, calls the reflective practitioner.
Okay, reflective practitioner. That term feels really important. We should probably circle back to that.
Absolutely. It's central.
Because this sounds like a complete philosophical overhaul of how leaders are developed. It's moving beyond just technical instruction towards something much closer to, I don't know, intellectual and even moral maturation.
That's a good way to put it. It's almost like the military saying, look, we no longer just need people who know the right answer from the book. We need people who know how to formulate the right question when the book doesn't apply.
Okay. Let's dig into that core philosophy then. It sounds like it requires a pretty radical shift in teaching methods, starting with just throwing out rote learning.
It really is an outright rebellion against rote learning and the, strict adherence to rigid doctrinal templates. Goodmanson is very clear on this.
He argues the doctrine isn't useless, though.
Oh no, doctrine is necessary. It provides a common language, a starting point, a shared understanding of basic procedures. But he argues that over-reliance on it, treating it as gospel, actively stymies the kind of intellectual growth needed for senior leadership.
Because if you're always looking for the single correct answer provided in the manual,
you stop looking for the creative, adaptive solution that a novel, unexpected problem demands. You default to the template, even when the situation screams for something different.
So the fourth way deliberately favors open-ended questioning instead. It sounds like the learning environment itself is designed to be messy, ambiguous.
Exactly. Messy, ambiguous, ill-defined. It's intentionally designed to mirror the complexity of real-world command decisions, where you rarely have all the information, objectives might conflict, and there's no clear right answer.
The training has to simulate the environment. If the real world is a complex, adaptive system,
then the training system can't be a linear, predictable checklist. That just creates a false sense of security. The pedagogical tool itself has to force the student to grapple with ambiguity, to tolerate it, even to thrive in it.
And this emphasis on grappling with ambiguity, that immediately connects us back to that theoretical backbone you mentioned earlier, Donald Schoen, and his concept of the reflective practitioner.
Yes, Schoen's work is fundamental here. He originally studied fields like architecture, urban planning, even psychotherapy.
Professions where problems are often unique, ill-defined.
Precisely. And the reflective practitioner, in Schoen's view, isn't defined by how well they've memorized past solutions or standard techniques. They're defined by their capacity to engage in what he called reflection in action.
Reflection in action. So thinking while doing.
Essentially, yes. They don't just execute a preformed plan rigidly. They're capable of thinking critically about their own assumptions, their actions, the evolving context, while they are in the middle of acting. They adjust course intelligently as the situation unfolds.
We've all seen the opposite, haven't we? Where a situation changes, maybe rapidly, and a leader just seems incapable of adapting because they're mentally trained to plan A.
Absolutely. So the immediate goal here with the fourth way is to form practitioners capable of that dynamic, adaptive thinking, and, crucially, capable of deeply rooted ethical reasoning at the same time.
That ethical piece feels really important, not just an add-on.
It's integral. By confronting officers with these ambiguous problems, often historical dilemmas with really high moral stakes, the training forces them to recognize that a leader isn't just a technical implementer of policy.
They're a moral agent.
They are a moral agent, responsible for the consequences of their decisions, required to maintain professional integrity even when, perhaps especially when, all the available choices seem bad.
I really appreciate that focus on the humane and holistic model. It acknowledges the psychological burden, the moral complexity of command. It moves away from seeing leadership as just a sort of mechanistic kill chain input-output function.
Right. The fourth way provides the intellectual architecture, you could say, to support carrying that moral and psychological load effectively.
It validates the idea that true professional excellence has to include things like intellectual humility, moral depth, self-awareness.
It absolutely does. It argues those aren't soft skills. They are core professional competencies for complex environments.
Okay, so this all sounds incredibly sophisticated, very forward-looking. Like something designed specifically for the complexities of 21st century warfare, post 9/11, hybrid threats, all that.
Right. It feels very contemporary.
But what's genuinely remarkable, you said earlier, is that Goodmanton explicitly roots this fourth way, not in recent events, but in a really ancient, rich intellectual tradition. He didn't invent this way of thinking. He sort of revived it for PME.
That's exactly it. And that historical grounding is what gives the fourth way much of its intellectual authority. It demonstrates that this approach, this integration of inquiry, reflection, and practice isn't just some passing pedagogical fad. It's drawing on a long tradition of excellence in developing leaders.
So let's look at those foundations. You mentioned 4 historical pillars that make up the fourth way's intellectual lineage. Where do we start?
We start way back. Pillar number 1 takes us to ancient Greece around 400 BC, Xenophon and the Socratic tradition.
Xenophon. Okay, I know the name. Anabasis, the March of the 10,000.
That's the one. And Xenophon is fascinating because he's the perfect embodiment of this bridge between philosophy and warfighting. He was a student of Socrates, deeply immersed in that method of rigorous questioning, challenging assumptions.
The Socratic method.
Right. But he wasn't just an armchair philosopher. He was a general, a hands-on leader, a chronicler of campaigns, and a participant in that absolutely brutal struggle documented in the Anabasis.
So his contribution wasn't just recording what happened.
No, it was much deeper. He demonstrated through his writing how effective leadership and strategy were profoundly informed by inquiry and dialogue. He showed the process of thinking.
How so? In the Anabasis, for instance.
Well, think about the context. You have this army of Greek mercenaries stranded deep inside hostile Persian territory. Their commanders have just been betrayed and executed. They're surrounded, demoralized, thousands of miles from home, facing almost certain annihilation.
Dire situation.
Extremely dire. And Xenophon recorded the council meetings they held. Not just the final decision like we decided to march north. He recorded the messy, urgent, often contentious life and death dialogue that led to those decisions. He showed his readers the reasoning processes behind command choices made under ultimate duress.
Wow. So he's documenting the Socratic method applied to survival.
In a sense, yes. Questioning assumptions even when panic or false certainty is psychologically appealing. Identifying the ethical dimensions, how do we treat captured guides, what are our obligations to the wounded, and linking self-knowledge, why am I proposing this route? Am I driven by fear or by rational assessment? Directly to leadership efficacy.
And the relevance for today's PME is?
It's profound. When a modern officer confronts a really complex moral dilemma, maybe the legality and proportionality of an airstrike in a densely populated urban area with conflicting intelligence.
A wicked problem.
A classic wicked problem. The fourth way uses reflective questioning, just like Xenophon implicitly documented, to navigate that dilemma. Instead of just hiding behind Rule 17b in the manual, the officer is trained to ask, what are the second and third order effects? What are my biases here? What are the competing values at stake? It's training in intellectual resilience for morally ambiguous situations.
Okay, that's a powerful start. Moving forward quite a bit to the 18th century, our second pillar introduces a different but crucial element, experiential learning. Who's this figure?
This is Count William of Schaumburg-Lippe. He was a German nobleman and a military reformer, working primarily for Portugal but influenced by Prussian ideas.
Okay, and his contribution.
His philosophy was a direct repudiation of the dominant military training of his time, which was very much about rote drill, parade ground precision, passive obedience.
The Frederick the Great model, maybe?
So,
Highly disciplined, but not necessarily adaptive.
Exactly. Schaumburg-Lippe's core belief was revolutionary for the 18th century. Effective officers learn best through active experimentation and discovery, not through passively absorbing doctrine handed down by a senior officer.
He understood that just reading about a tactical maneuver in a book doesn't really embed the principle deeply enough.
Precisely. Reading isn't doing. His method was about forcing internalization through action. He would urge his students, often very young, low-ranking officers, to devise and then physically test their own tactical solutions in field exercises.
So he'd give them a problem, and they'd have to come up with a plan and try it out.
Yes. They had to put their theories into practice, observe the immediate consequences, what worked, what didn't, and then, crucially, reflect on why their trial succeeded or failed. It made the learning active, sometimes painfully so. They internalized principles through trial, error, and guided reflection.
That sounds incredibly modern. Like he was running a kind of, I don't know, 18th century simulation or sandbox environment centuries before computers.
That's a great analogy. He was absolutely anticipating modern experiential learning theories. Thinkers like John Dewey or David Kolb, who emphasized the learning cycle of experience, reflection, conceptualization, and experimentation.
And Goodmanson picks up on this.
Directly. He leverages Schaumburg-Lippe's example to underscore the importance of discovery-based learning in the fourth way. It fosters autonomy. The officer isn't just executing someone else's plan. And it builds adaptive thinking. When you've personally experienced the failure of your own proposed solution, you internalize the limits of generalized doctrine much more profoundly than if you just read about it.
And that autonomy is key for modern warfare, with decentralized operations.
Absolutely critical. Junior officers are frequently required to make high-stakes decisions far from higher headquarters, often with limited guidance. They need that practiced ability to think and adapt independently.
Okay, Pillar 3 brings us into the institutional history of the U.S. military itself. This shows the idea isn't just an external import, but has roots within the system. Who are we talking about?
Major General James Carson Breckinridge. He's a key figure in Marine Corps history.
What was his role?
He was the founder, essentially, of the Marine Corps schools at Quantico back in the early 20th century. And his driving goal was reform. He wanted to combat the rote instruction methods that were prevalent in military schools across the board at that time.
So, similar dissatisfaction to Schaumburg-Lippe, but within the USMC context. What was his specific vision for reform?
He sought to transform PME from a place of passive reception into a vigorous, dynamic forum for intellectual exchange and debate. He didn't want students just diligently taking notes on established tactics.
He wanted them arguing about them.
Exactly. He wanted them to challenge those tactics, debate their utility in different scenarios, engage in critical, sometimes even contentious discussion with their peers, and significantly with their instructors.
Now that sounds radical within a military hierarchy. Encouraging junior officers to actively challenge established doctrine in front of senior instructors. That takes institutional courage.
It really does. He was deliberately creating a culture where intellectual disagreement wasn't seen as insubordination, but as a professional requirement for growth and innovation.
And that's his lasting relevance for the fourth way.
Precisely. He laid the institutional groundwork, the precedent, for fostering a reflective, questioning culture within PME. He proved, within the Marine Corps context, that inquiry and open dialogue weren't incompatible with military discipline. They could coexist and actually strengthen the force. This gave Goodmanson a powerful internal precedent to point to when he later introduced the case method project. It wasn't some foreign academic concept. It had echoes in their own history.
Okay, fascinating. And finally, the fourth pillar. This one provides the actual how-to, the pedagogical methodology that makes the fourth way function in the classroom day to day.
Right. This comes from the world of business education, Wallace Brett Donham, and the case method.
Harvard Business School, right?
That's him. He was the visionary dean there in the early 20th century who really pioneered and institutionalized the case method pedagogy.
What was his insight?
He recognized that simply teaching abstract business theories or principles was largely useless for preparing actual managers and leaders. They didn't need just theory, they needed practice in making difficult decisions under conditions of uncertainty with incomplete information.
Sounds familiar.
Very familiar. So his method involved giving students detailed accounts of real-world business dilemmas cases. The students had to immerse themselves in the situation, analyze complex, often messy and conflicting data, diagnose the core problem, propose concrete solutions, and then rigorously defend their reasoning in class discussions.
And crucially, they compared their proposed solutions with what actually happened.
Yes, that comparison was key. It wasn't just about coming up with a solution, but about comparing their decision-making process and their anticipated outcomes against the historical reality. This fostered sharp analytical reasoning and, just as importantly, developed comfort with ambiguity and the ability to make judgments with imperfect information.
And Goodmanson saw the direct applicability to PME.
He absolutely did. He essentially adapted this proven pedagogical method for the military context, using what are often called decision-forcing cases, or DFCs. These DFCs become the cognitive exercises, the mental laboratories where officers practice judgment. It aligns that rigorous academic methodology, honed at places like Harvard, directly with the practical demands of military professional practice.
Okay, so let's recap the foundation. We've got the deep philosophical grounding and inquiry from Xenophon and Socrates.
Right, the why ask questions part.
Then the mandate for active experimentation and learning through doing from Schomburg-Lipp.
The learn by trying part.
The institutional precedent encouraged to foster debate from Breckinridge within the military itself.
The it can be done here part.
And finally, the proven pedagogical engine of the case method from Donham to actually structure the learning.
The how to actually do it in the classroom part. It's really a powerful synthesis, isn't it? Designed to create not just a technician, but a professional capable of operating effectively right at that messy intersection of theory and practice.
A professional whose actions are based on deep self-awareness, rigorous analysis, calculated risk, not just on recalling paragraph 3, subsection B of the manual.
That's the ideal, yes. Action-oriented, but reflective.
Okay, that sets the historical and philosophical stage beautifully. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. The real-world proof of concept, the case method project at the Marine Corps University. This was the big, decade-long initiative running roughly 2007 to 2017, right? This is where all that theory hit the ground.
Exactly. This was where Gudmundsson and his colleagues really operationalized the fourth way principles. And it wasn't just a small pilot program, it was a significant, integrated, sustained effort to fundamentally redesign how Marine officers were developed, particularly at the career level schools.
So walk us through the setup. If I'm a student in this environment, what does it actually look like? What am I doing?
Well, the standard setup, the core activity, involves students being presented with very specific, detailed historical military problems. These often came in the form of map-based exercises, tactical decision games, or TDGs, where the terrain, weather, known enemy positions, your own unit status, it's all laid out.
Like a snapshot in time.
Precisely. Or they might use more complex, narrative-driven decision-forcing cases, DFCs, which could involve diplomatic factors, political constraints, ethical dilemmas, alongside the tactical picture. The key is that these cases were deliberately designed to have incomplete information, sometimes conflicting objectives, and almost always high stakes.
Realism was key.
Absolutely. They mirrored the fog and friction of real command.
And the assignment wasn't go look up what happened in the history books and tell us.
Definitely not. That would defeat the whole purpose. The primary requirement, the absolute core of the exercise, was for the student, often working individually first, then maybe in small groups, to formulate and commit to an original course of action.
They had to invent their own solution.
Yes. Based on the limited information provided, they had to decide, what are my orders? What's my plan? What risks am I accepting? And then, crucially, they had to be prepared to robustly defend their proposed actions, their underlying rationale, the assumptions they made, how they calculated risk before a panel of their peers and experienced instructors in a really rigorous open discussion.
So immediate intellectual accountability. You couldn't hide. You owned your decision right there.
You owned it. The focus was on the why behind your decision, even more than the what.
Let's focus on the pedagogical design here, because this seems critical for actually training adaptability, not just talking about it.
Yeah.
You mentioned something called the crucial delay earlier.
Yeah.
How did that specific mechanical trick work in the case method?
The crucial delay. This is pure pedagogical genius, really central to making the DFC work as intended. The rule was strict. The instructor was absolutely forbidden from revealing the actual historical resolution, what the real commander did back then, and what happened until after the students had gone through the entire deliberative process.
After they proposed their solutions, argued for them, faced critique from their peers,
Yeah.
only then did they find out what really happened.
Exactly. Only after they had fully committed to and defended their own line of reasoning.
Why is that timing so incredibly essential? What does delaying the reveal achieve?
Well, think about what happens if you reveal the historical outcome too early.
People just work backwards, right?
Yeah.
They try to figure out why the historical commander did what they did and justify that.
Precisely. The exercise devolves into reverse engineering the school solution. It becomes about finding the right answer that already exists. But by deliberately delaying that revelation, the student is forced into genuine metacognition, thinking about their own thinking.
How does that work? They compare their plan to the historical one.
Yes. Once their own reasoning is fully articulated and defended, then the historical outcome is revealed. And often, maybe usually, it's different from what the student proposed, sometimes radically different. Now the student is forced to compare their carefully constructed reasoning process, their internal logic, how they prioritized objectives, what information they weighted heavily against the historical reality and the reasoning of the actual commander.
Okay, but hold on. You mentioned metacognition, thinking about thinking. That sounds important, but also a bit abstract. How do you actually observe or measure that happening in a classroom full of, pretty action-oriented military officers?
That's a really fair question, and it gets to the heart of how learning is assessed in this model. You don't measure metacognition with a bubble sheet, obviously. You observe it in the quality of the comparison and reflection phase after the historical outcome is revealed.
So it's in the discussion that follows.
Exactly. When the historical outcome conflicts with the student's proposal, a good facilitator doesn't just say, "See, you are wrong." They guide the discussion with questions like, "Okay, Captain, your plan focused heavily on securing Hill 101. The historical commander bypassed it. What assumption did you make about the enemy's intent that they clearly didn't share? Or, which piece of intelligence did you prioritize that, in hindsight, maybe led you down the wrong path?"
So the learning isn't just what happened historically, but why their own mental model produced a different result. It's about diagnosing their own thinking process.
Precisely. It fosters that crucial self-awareness of their own cognitive biases, their tendencies under pressure, how they frame problems. That's observable in the quality of their reflection and their ability to articulate why they thought the way they did.
That really makes the process the product, doesn't it? The thinking itself is the point.
It is. And speaking of avoiding formulaic thinking, the source material really stresses that students were deliberately denied fixed analytical templates or checklists for solving these problems. Why was preventing them from using, say, a standard 5-paragraph order format as a solution template so crucial?
Yeah, why not give them a structure? Wouldn't that help?
Well, think about what happens if you provide a rigid template. You end up rewarding compliance with the template format, right? Filling in the blanks correctly.
Okay.
But the modern battlefield, as we've said, often requires invention, not compliance. It demands solutions tailored to unique circumstances. By deliberately denying those fixed templates, the Case Method Project compelled students to invent their own decision-making frameworks on the fly.
So they had to decide for themselves what factors mattered most in this specific messy situation.
Exactly. Is it the terrain, the ticking clock, the ethical constraints, the fragile logistics chain, the enemy's likely psychology? They had to wrestle with the complexity and create an original framework to prioritize and integrate those factors. This promotes genuine intellectual independence and discourages that plug-and-play formulaic thinking that can be so dangerous when reality diverges from the textbook.
And these exercises, these DFCs, they weren't purely abstract intellectual puzzles either, were they? The sources mentioned they were deliberately infused with realism and emotional engagement.
Yes, that's the moral laboratory aspect we touched on earlier, tying back to that humane and holistic approach. They worked hard to make these exercises feel real, to have emotional weight, by explicitly including the human dimension. Maybe the case involves difficult choices about civilian casualties or the impact of a decision on troop morale or dealing with unreliable allies. The discussions weren't just about vectors of attack, they were about the human consequences of command.
So drawing the participants into the actual human drama of the historical dilemma.
Exactly. This helps cultivate empathy, which is crucial for leadership. And it forces students to confront their own emotional responses to pressure, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity factors that are usually ignored in purely technical training, but are incredibly real in actual command. It helps them become aware of how stress might affect their own judgment.
Okay, so after a decade of this sustained effort, putting officers through this demanding process, what were the results? What were the measurable learning outcomes? Did the case method project actually succeed in creating these reflective practitioners?
The evidence reported from the project suggests it was highly successful, yes. The outcomes consistently demonstrated an effective balance between academic depth, really understanding the theory and history, and practical relevance, being able to apply it under pressure.
What specific improvements did they observe in students?
The reports cited several key areas. Students showed significantly improved critical reasoning skills, their ability to analyze complex problems, identify assumptions, evaluate evidence. They demonstrated heightened adaptability, especially when facilitators threw mid-scenario curveballs or injected new information that invalidated their initial plan.
They got better at thinking on their feet.
Much better. And crucially, participants reported increased confidence. Not arrogance, but genuine confidence in their ability to navigate situations defined by extreme uncertainty and ambiguity. They'd practiced it.
And beyond the individual skills, what about the cultural impact? You mentioned intellectual humility earlier. Did that actually take root?
It seems it did. The very nature of the collective dialogue, the peer critique, fostered a professional ethos that valued humility and curiosity. Think about it. You spend hours crafting what you think is a brilliant textbook perfect plan. You defend it passionately. Then the historical outcome is revealed, and you find out your brilliant plan likely would have failed miserably due to some unforeseen contingency, some small detail you overlooked. And maybe the historical commander whose initial actions you dismissed as amateurish actually succeeded through a stroke of improvisation or a deeper understanding you missed.
That would be humbling.
Incredibly grounding. It teaches you viscerally to respect the sheer contingency of warfare, the role of friction, chance, and the enemy's independent will. It forces you to question your own certainty.
So the key lesson wasn't just learning history, it was learning the limits of planning. That no doctrine, no theory, no brilliant plan can guarantee success.
That seems to be the crucial takeaway, especially for today's volatile world. Officers learned that the best plan is often just the least bad option, rigorously analyzed and adapted on the fly. They learned to be comfortable with uncertainty rather than seeking false certainty.
Which affirms what John Dewey said about learning, right? That genuine understanding comes from actively wrestling with the problem, from reflective experience, not just passively receiving information.
Exactly. The case method project seems to have provided exactly that kind of deep reflective experience, preparing officers for a world where they have to be comfortable making decisions without all the answers.
Okay, we've thoroughly explored the practical application, how it worked. Let's shift our focus back a bit now to the underlying mechanisms. What's the theoretical engine driving the success observed in the case method project? You called it the Socratic application model.
Right. This model is really about integrating that inquiry-based learning, that Socratic questioning, directly into the process of professional development. The aim isn't just technical competence, like knowing how to operate a weapon system, or even mastery of a subject like military history. The aim is to cultivate intellectual virtue.
Intellectual virtue, meaning
Meaning the ongoing habit of critical questioning, reflective thinking, and continuous learning. It's about developing the character of the mind, not just filling it with facts.
Okay, let's delve deeper now into Schoen's concept, specifically that idea of reflection in action. We talked about it being thinking while doing. How does that actually manifest in a high-stakes professional environment, and how does the fourth way actively train that capability?
Reflection in action is really about that capacity for dynamic adaptation, thinking on your feet when things go sideways. Schoen used examples like a master surgeon encountering an unexpected complication during an operation.
They don't just stop, right? They don't say, hold on, let me go consult the textbook.
Exactly. They assess the new situation, they adjust their theory of the case, they modify their approach, they adapt their physical technique, all in the moment while the operation is ongoing. They are actively thinking critically while they are acting, integrating feedback instantly.
That requires incredible mental flexibility, almost zero latency between observation, thought, and adjusted action.
It does, and it's the fundamental difference between just reacting to problems as they pop up versus proactively adapting your entire framework as the situation evolves.
So how does the case method train that specific high-level skill?
It provides a safe, controlled laboratory to repeatedly practice that reflective capacity. By simulating those complex moral and operational problems, throwing the student into the high-stakes dilemmas faced by historical commanders, it creates opportunities to practice thinking and acting simultaneously. You make a decision, you see its immediate simulated consequence, you reflect on why it happened, you adjust, you decide again.
And critically, you can do this without the potentially devastating real-world consequences of failure. You can practice failing, reflecting, and improving. Failing forward.
Precisely. It allows for experimentation and learning from mistakes in a way that's just not possible on a real battlefield or in many other high-stakes professions. It builds the mental muscles for reflection and action through repetition.
And this capacity for growth, this muscle building, seems baked into the very structure of the Socratic application model itself. You mentioned it's an iterative cycle. Can you lay out that full cycle of continuous learning for us?
Yeah, the process is designed to be self-reinforcing, a continuous loop. It typically begins with questioning.
Interrogating the problem, the assumptions, the constraints.
Right. What's really going on here? What am I taking for granted? This questioning naturally leads into reflection.
Actively considering alternatives, recognizing your own biases, weighing different factors.
Exactly. You're thinking through the possibilities. That reflection then informs the decision you have to commit to a course of action based on your analysis.
You propose your plan in the DFC.
You do. Following that decision and its simulated execution or discussion comes the crucial comparison phase.
This is where you contrast your reasoning and your outcome with the historical result, or maybe with the solutions proposed by your peers.
Yes. What did they see that I missed? Why did my approach differ? What were the critical points of divergence in our thinking?
And the final step in the cycle.
The final step is synthesis. This is where the learning really sticks. It's the internalization phase. The officer takes the new insights gained from that comparison, the understanding of their own bias, the appreciation for a different factor, the consequence of a flawed assumption, and integrates it into their mental framework. They refine their ability to think. They don't just record a new historical fact.
Questioning, reflection, decision, comparison, synthesis. It's a loop.
It's a continuous loop. Each time you go through it, prompted by a new case or a new challenge, your intellectual framework should become more robust, more flexible, more self-aware. It ensures that intellectual growth is ongoing, not something that stops when you graduate the course.
And that cycle, as you said, it clearly echoes ancient Socratic dialogue, that back and forth of questioning and refining understanding. But it also aligns remarkably well with modern cognitive science theories of metacognition and expert learning, doesn't it?
It really does. It leverages what we know about how people develop deep expertise through deliberate practice involving feedback, reflection, and refinement of mental models. It turns every problem encountered, every DFC, into a tool for sharpening the mind itself.
Every problem solved becomes a sharpening stone.
Well put. And this focus on developing the mind of the leader, not just their technical skills, is why the source material repeatedly describes the fourth way as a more humane and holistic education.
Humane and holistic. Let's unpack that. The humane aspect seems crucial, especially in the context of warfare.
It is. It represents a philosophical stance, really. It's about explicitly recognizing officers not merely as instruments of state policy, cogs in a machine, but as complex moral and psychological agents who have to be equipped to wrestle with profound ethical and human complexity.
They have to be trained for the weight of their decisions.
Exactly. And the dialogue inherent in the case method, especially around those historical dilemmas, deliberately compels students to explore the ethical dimensions right alongside the tactical or strategic ones. They can't be separated.
So they might confront situations where the tactically optimal solution carries an enormous moral cost, or where the right moral choice seems strategically disastrous.
All the time. That's the reality of leadership in conflict. The fourth way forces them to bridge that gap, to grapple with those tensions explicitly, rather than ignoring them or pretending there's always an easy answer.
In grappling with that, does that foster specific qualities?
The argument is that this holistic approach inherently fosters empathy, understanding the human cost. It fosters moral courage, the willingness to make difficult ethical choices under pressure, and it reinforces professional integrity. These aren't nice-to-haves, they're essential.
Especially in modern conflicts, where the lines are blurry, where troops are interacting directly with civilian populations, operating under intense media scrutiny, facing information warfare.
In those environments, that blend of traditional professional competence with what you might call civic virtue, ethical awareness, empathy, sound judgment becomes absolutely indispensable. When Schoen talked about reflection, he argued it humanizes professional action. The fourth way seems to mandate that connection. The moral decision and the tactical decision are intertwined and must be evaluated together for the professional act to have integrity.
Okay, this sounds like a really compelling, theoretically sound, and potentially transformative model backed by that decade of practical evidence from the MCU project. But, and it's a big but, implementing this kind of deep philosophical revolution inside a massive, hierarchical, tradition-bound, and often risk-averse organization like the military, that must be incredibly difficult. Let's transition to Section 5. Integrating the fourth way into modern PME. What are the hurdles?
You've absolutely hit on the biggest challenge. Implementation isn't easy. It requires overcoming some deeply embedded cultural norms and structural barriers within military education and the broader institution.
You're asking an organization that, for centuries, has been built on obedience, predictability, and following orders, to suddenly start prizing intellectual independence, embracing ambiguity, and even seeing failure in the classroom as potentially productive. That's a huge cultural shift.
It's massive. The required shift in pedagogy is fundamental. You have to move away from predominantly hierarchical models where the instructor is the sage on the stage, the authority figure dispensing established knowledge.
The giver of truth.
Right. You have to move towards dialogic pedagogies, more collaborative, inquiry-driven approaches where the instructor's role is different and where challenging disagreement is not just tolerated but actively encouraged as part of the learning process.
And it also requires a shift in focus.
Yes, institutions need to shift focus, at least partially, away from purely content-driven syllabi, where the main goal is, say, ensuring every student can recite the specific causes of World War I from memory.
Checking the boxes of knowledge covered.
Exactly. Towards more process-oriented learning where the primary goal is mastering the method of inquiry, the critical thinking skills, the reflective habits that allow a student to understand complex causation in any context, not just WWI. That's a profound shift in how institutions might measure educational success.
But this immediately raises a potential conflict, doesn't it? And this is maybe where some friction comes in. We've been talking about dialogue, reflection, embracing ambiguity. Doesn't that run counter to the absolute need for command, clarity, decisiveness, and rapid action on the battlefield? You need officers who can give clear orders and act decisively, not ones who are lost in Socratic introspection when bullets are flying.
That is the essential tension, absolutely. And it's a criticism that the proponents of the fourth way have to address directly. Their argument is that the decisiveness required in combat actually stems from the confidence built during this rigorous process of reflection and intellectual challenge in a safe environment. Because the officer has already wrestled with ambiguity, they've rigorously interrogated their own assumptions, they've defended their reasoning against sharp critique before the crisis hits, they've practiced thinking under pressure. So when they face real duress, they aren't engaging in deep introspection for the first time. They're activating practiced habits of reflection in action. Their decisiveness comes from a deeper, more adaptable understanding, not just from rigid adherence to a potentially flawed plan.
Okay, I see the argument. The intellectual humility cultivated before the battle allows for more adaptive confidence during the battle. It's practice for thinking under fire.
That's the idea. But making this shift requires a complete redefinition of the instructor's role, as you hinted. They can no longer just be the subject matter expert who delivers lectures and grades papers based on doctrinal correctness.
What do they become?
They have to become skilled facilitators of inquiry. Their primary job isn't to provide the answers. It's to ask the right questions, to maintain the intellectual pressure in the room, to guide the discussion towards deeper ethical and strategic implications, and crucially, to manage the ambiguity and disagreement productively without ever dictating a conclusion or shutting down debate.
That sounds like a very different and frankly much harder skill set. Someone could be a highly successful, decorated military commander, decisive, confident, experienced, but not necessarily possess the specific skills needed for that kind of facilitation.
Like intellectual humility, managing group dynamics, guiding reflection without leading. Exactly. It requires a unique blend. They need deep subject matter expertise, yes, but also that intellectual humility, the willingness to say, I don't have the definitive answer here, or let's explore why Captain Smith's unconventional idea might have merit, even if it contradicts my experience. They need flexibility, patience, and specialized training in pedagogy, in Socratic questioning, in guiding discussions without imposing their authority. It's far more challenging than preparing and delivering a standard lecture on doctrine.
So the institution can't just assign good officers to be instructors. It has to invest significantly in dedicated training for instructors, not just in the subject matter, but in the philosophy and techniques of inquiry-based learning itself.
Absolutely critical. They need educators who are comfortable tolerating ambiguity and disagreement, who can foster genuine, challenging dialogue among officers who are often naturally conditioned towards seeking certainty and consensus.
Because if the instructors themselves aren't trained or comfortable with this, the whole thing collapses, right? The classroom just reverts to a guessing game of what does the instructor want to hear.
It collapses immediately. The students, who are very good at reading cues, will default to trying to please the authority figure. The fourth way fundamentally redefines the teacher-student relationship. It becomes more of a partnership in inquiry, demanding mutual intellectual respect, not just deference to rank or experience.
Okay, let's talk about curriculum design then. If you're moving away from content silos and fixed templates, how do you actually structure the coursework to support this fourth way approach?
The curricula themselves have to be radically redesigned. You can't just sprinkle a few DFCs into an existing traditional syllabus. It requires deep integration of decision-forcing cases, dedicated time for structured reflection, both individual and group, and very importantly, a commitment to interdisciplinary study.
Interdisciplinary, meaning you can't just study, say, the Battle of Gettysburg purely as a tactical problem in isolation.
Exactly. You have to break down the traditional silos between departments. Courses need to intentionally combine history, ethics, strategy, leadership psychology, maybe even cultural anthropology or economics, not as separate modules, but within a single, unified framework of applied inquiry.
So when analyzing a historical command decision, let's say, MacArthur's choices during the Korean War, a fourth-way curriculum would push students to simultaneously discuss.
All of it. The strategic geopolitical implications of his actions, the ethical costs and considerations like the potential use of nuclear weapons or the relationship with allies, the psychological factors influencing his decisions and the enemy's response, the relevant historical precedents or lack thereof, all examined together, often through the lens of a specific DFC focused on a critical decision point.
That makes the learning environment exponentially richer, more complex, and arguably much more realistic than a standard history course or a tactics lecture.
It aims to be, yes.
Yes.
It mirrors the way complex problems present themselves in the real world, rarely fitting neatly into one disciplinary box.
And quickly, what role does technology play in enabling or enhancing this?
Technology can be a powerful enhancer, for sure. Things like sophisticated digital simulations, perhaps even virtual reality environments, can create more immersive and dynamic decision-forcing scenarios. Collaborative online platforms can allow for asynchronous case discussions, engaging students across different locations or schedules.
So tech can expand the laboratory.
It can expand and deepen the laboratory effect, absolutely. It allows for testing hypotheses in near real time, exploring branching consequences, and facilitating broader collaboration.
But, as you pointed out earlier when discussing the challenges, the ultimate success doesn't hinge on having the fanciest simulation, does it? It comes back to culture.
It rests almost entirely on genuine institutional commitment to intellectual freedom and valuing the process. If the institution's reward systems, the promotion boards, the performance evaluations, the way success is defined in PME, if those systems still primarily reward officers who provide the safe, doctrinally correct answers, or if they penalize thoughtful failure or intellectual risk-taking in the classroom.
Then the fourth way will be subtly, or maybe not so subtly, sabotaged. Officers will optimize for what gets them promoted.
Exactly. That's a powerful point. If the career track incentivizes certainty and compliance, the officers, being rational actors, will deliver certainty and compliance, even if it compromises their long-term adaptability. The institution has to genuinely, demonstrably value the process of inquiry over the product of a single correct answer.
The value needs to be placed on the quality and rigor of the reasoning presented, the robustness of the defense of a decision, even if flawed, and the depth of self-awareness demonstrated in the reflection phase. Maybe even more than the outcome of that initial simulated decision.
That's the ideal. It's a monumental cultural shift, no doubt about it. But the source material argues passionately that it's an essential shift if military organizations want leaders truly prepared for the complex security challenges of the future.
This has been a really fascinating exploration of what sounds like a quiet but potentially profound revolution in military thinking. Let's try to synthesize the overall impact of Goodmanson's fourth way.
Well, I think at its core, the fourth way isn't just a tweak or an update to PME curriculum guides. It's really aiming for a fundamental redefinition of military professionalism itself for the modern era.
How so?
It explicitly recognizes that in a world characterized by complex, ambiguous, often decentralized conflict, effective leadership can't just be based on technical skill or doctrinal knowledge. It must be rooted in deeper qualities like intellectual agility, moral integrity, and reflective judgment.
So by successfully reviving that Socratic spirit of inquiry and embedding it within a modern, highly operational PME context using the case method.
Right. By doing that, the fourth way directly addresses the critical goal of cultivating genuinely reflective officers. These are leaders who are capable of independent, critical judgment, who possess sound ethical reasoning, and who can demonstrate dynamic, adaptive thinking under pressure.
And those qualities, independent judgment, ethical reasoning, adaptability, these are precisely what's essential for navigating the kinds of security environments we face now, aren't they? Highly uncertain, volatile, complex, where the adversary is often just as flexible and adaptive, if not more so.
Exactly. The research coming out of the Case Method Project strongly suggests that while implementing the fourth way is undoubtedly difficult, requires significant investment in cultural change, its potential for cultivating the intellectual resilience needed for future conflicts makes it not just valuable, but perhaps indispensable for long-term officer development.
Okay, so that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listener, to take away and maybe mull over.
Goodmanson's fourth way, as we've discussed extensively, was designed for military education, an institution often seen as the epitome of certainty, authority, and rigid hierarchy.
Right, the opposite of ambiguity and reflection, you might think.
Yet this very institution, through efforts like the Case Method Project, found that in order to survive and thrive in a complex world, it needed to fundamentally shift towards valuing process over product, embracing inquiry, and cultivating intellectual humility.
So, if an organization built on centuries of hierarchy like the military recognizes the strategic necessity of moving towards a more Socratic, reflective model specifically to cultivate adaptability.
Then it raises a really important question for you, regardless of your own profession. What established field you work in, whether it's medicine, law, finance, education, engineering, tech, anything might be similarly, perhaps unknowingly, crippled by its own reliance on fixed templates, established procedures, and a culture that maybe discourages questioning or rewards certainty over adaptability.
Think about the most complex, messy, wicked problems you encounter in your daily work. Do the standard operating procedures always provide the answer? Or do those problems demand that you or your team essentially invent a solution on the fly, navigating ambiguity with judgment?
That space, the space where the manual runs out, where creativity and adaptation are required, that's where the principles of the fourth way become universally relevant. And that might be where your industry, your organization, needs its own quiet, reflective overhaul.
Maybe it's time to start your own cycle. Questioning, reflection, decision, comparison, and synthesis right in your own professional life.
It's a powerful framework for continuous learning anywhere.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into the fourth way. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this really crucial body of source material on military education and leadership development.
It was a pleasure.
We look forward to exploring the next stack of fascinating sources with you very soon, right here on The Deep Dive.